But thank you everyone for joining us today for the What's New with Partner Government Agencies, or PGAs webinar. We're glad you joined, and there's a lot to keep up with, so let's get started. My name is Ann Meredith, and I am the Senior Marketing Analyst for Customs Brokerage at UPS, and it's a great pleasure to host this call and introduce you to our fantastic speakers. We are joined today by Rob Feikeisen, who is the Customs Brokerage Compliance Supervisor. Rob has 16 years of customs brokerage experience and has been a licensed broker for 7 years. Rob has worked in brokerage operations, training, and is now in audit and regulatory affairs for the UPS Customs and Trade Compliance Group. We are also joined by Kelly Wilton, who is our cross-border trade compliance manager at UPS. Kelly has worked in the customs brokerage industry since 1982 and earned her customs brokerage license in 1988. In her current role, Kelly has compliance oversight of UPS brokerage offices on both the U.S. northern and southern borders. Some of you in the audience might know Kelly as an active member of various trade associations, including Board of Directors position with the Northern Border Customs Brokers Association. And as a special treat, we also have Stuart Schmidt, Customs Brokerage Compliance Manager at UPS, who will be sitting in the background fielding any questions that might come in during the webinar. So welcome, Rob, Kelly, and Stuart. Thank you so much for your time today. Before we move on to the agenda, I have a few administrative updates. First, the meeting is being recorded, and it will be made available to everyone who registered after the event. And we encourage participation and would like to ensure we answer your questions. So please make sure you use the Q&A function at any point during the call. Remember, Stuart's going to be there waiting, so let's keep him busy. You can thank me later, Stuart. We'll try our best to answer your questions live on the call through the Q&A function, or if necessary, we will contact you privately after the call. So for legal purposes, I'm going to read the following message verbatim, and then we'll be ready to start today's great content. This presentation is for information purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice. Please consult with your own legal counsel for each such advice. Do not rely on this information without performing your own research. Okay, with that done, let's take a look at our agenda. First, we are going to have a quick background review of PGA and their interface with ACE. Then we will review Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, and the beta test pilot expected to launch in October of this year. Then we have a few updates to share for Food and Drug Administration, followed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where we're going to dive into the National Organics Program and the Lacey Act. Finally, we will wrap up with some EPA updates and resources that should be helpful. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly for our first content review.
Okay, thank you, Ann, very much, and good morning to everyone. So I want to give just a brief update on what PGA is and what it's all about. It's a very broad term. Of course, as you can see on screen, it stands for Partner Government Agency, but they are a group of federal agencies that have regulatory authority over certain products. They regulate domestic products as well as imports, but of course today we're going to focus on those imports. And it's important for you to know if any of the products you import are regulated by any of the agencies. Because knowing what the requirements are and knowing how they're regulated will help to ensure a smooth and expeditious import process. Now, there are about 50 PGAs in the US, and some of them have overlapping jurisdiction. So I want to point out, for example, the first example I'll talk about is FDA, which stands for the Food and Drug Administration. They regulate, well, food and drugs, but food also includes pet foods. But pet food is also regulated by the USDA. That's the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Going back to FDA, they regulate cosmetic, food contact items such as dinnerware and cookware, medical devices, including even things such as eyeglasses. They're considered a medical device, but also radiation emitting devices such as TVs, computer monitors, and so on. And then going back to dual regulation, those TVs are also regulated by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, since they receive a signal. But what's interesting about the FCC is that there are currently no data reporting requirements at time of import. It's just that the importer has to ensure that their product was manufactured in accordance with the established standards and get labeled as such. Another example, and this will be quickly, is the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. They're concerned with items that may harm the environment, such as toxic chemicals, ozone depleting chemicals, pesticides, even gas or diesel powered engines, to make sure their emissions are within acceptable limits. The VNE, Vehicle and Engines programs, it covers not only the gas or diesel engine itself, but also any vehicle that contains that engine. So if that vehicle is going to be used on public roads, it's also subject to the DOT, the Department of Transportation, just to make sure it meets all safety standards, such as seat belts, indicator lights, like turn signals and brake lights, and airbags, and so on. So again, this is just a very small view of some of the common products that a PGA might be involved in, and shows how there is frequently some overlap. But the full list of commodities that are regulated it's almost endless, right? But it's the importer's responsibility to know if their goods are regulated, and if so, what those requirements are for import. Each PGA is intended to protect the U.S. consumer in some fashion, so ensuring full compliance with the standards and regulations during the manufacturing process, and then reporting all of that needed data at time of entry, it's a very important responsibility of the importer of record. So let's jump to our next slide, which talks about the ACE, the Automated Commercial Environment. So when we talk about a PGA going live, or the PGA is issuing a mandate, that generally means that the PGA has moved over to ACE, which again is the Automated Commercial Environment. ACE is the system of record for customs, and gradually each of the PGAs will have access. Before ACE, and as demonstrated on the left-hand side of this table, there was a lot of duplication of data submission and a lot of paper forms required. We frequently had to utilize the PGA's own system, apart and separate from transmitting our data to customs. But now with ACE, all of the data required by both customs and the PGA gets submitted at the same time. The broker receives status updates directly from ACE, and that lets us know if customs has released the shipment and if the PGA has released it. It does frequently happen where customs might release it, but the PGA wants to hold it for a document review or physical inspection of the goods. So receiving those messages direct from ACE is extremely beneficial. But it's also important to note, if the PGA refuses admittance of the goods, even after customs has released it, those goods will need to be exported or destroyed. And failure to do that generally results in liquidated damages of up to 3 times the value of the shipment. So staying on top of the ACE messaging from the PGA is crucial. We must ensure that the goods are not used, sold, or distributed until after the PGA sends its may proceed message. So if you've got an ACE portal, or if you use our portal, the FGB Flex Global View, you will have direct visibility to that PGA messaging. So that's it for the overview, very quick, very brief, but I want to turn it over to Rob now, who will talk about CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So Rob, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. The Consumer Product Safety Commission really protects consumers from products that come into the U.S. that may not be up to standard. So it covers quite a wide variety of products, apparel and some textile products, especially for babies and children, infant toys and other activity products, furniture, carpet, mattresses, jewelry, bags, accessories. You know, they're all laid out on the screen there. Strollers, baby carriers, bottles, outdoor and recreational products like ATVs, bicycles, art materials, and then just a wide variety of miscellaneous things that that consumers buy, obviously, and that are imported into the U.S. They do have a full list of tariff numbers available that they have posted for public, so you can go to the e-filing page at the CPSC, the link there at the bottom right, and access the full list of tariff numbers. So you can certainly take a look. You can reach out to us if you're with UPS and access to determine if the tariff numbers you're using are on the list, and then get more information on what's required. Right now, the CPSC is filing paper certificates, but they are starting an e-filing beta pilot. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the e-filing beta test pilot is starting in October of this year, and they're testing transmission through ACE of the CPSC data. So currently, like as I mentioned, there's a paper certificate that importers provide to CPSC or to customs when their covered products are imported. And what they're testing is transmitting this data electronically and through ACE to customs and to CPSC so that paper certificates would no longer be used. So it's important to remember that the entry requirements aren't changing. It's just how that information and how the required data from the certificate of conformity is being presented to customs and CPSC. So instead of being a paper process, it'll all be electronic through ACE. So there's a couple of different ways you can submit data once it becomes mandatory, or if you're participating in the beta pilot, there's going to be an online repository in a sense where you can submit all of your information to CPSC online and store it there, and then you'd get a unique ID that you would be able to submit with your imports. You'd present that to your customs broker and they would submit it so CPSC can match up that data in the background and take a look. You can also just submit a full set of data elements electronically. So if you have a copy of the certificate of conformity that is presented with the customs documents, then your broker can submit it manually into ACE if you're not using the online repository or registry of goods. Right now, UPS is supporting clients that are participating in the e-filing beta pilot. They're the ones that are going to help develop the message set and the registry, and test to make sure that everything is going smoothly and that the e-filing process works. If you're interested in participating, they are still taking applications. The CPSC, you would need to apply directly to them, but certainly reach out to your UPS brokerage operations contact, and they can assist you. Make sure you let us know that you want to participate, and then they can help with how to do that. And we will definitely support you and go through the testing process. The testing process starts in October and it'll run through April 2024, but certainly after that, it's going to be mandatory. So at the end of 2024 or perhaps beginning of 2025, more likely, there isn't an exact date yet, is when the e-filing will be mandatory. So you will no longer be submitting paper certificates. You'd be giving the broker information to submit electronically through ACE to customs and CPSC. If you do want to participate, keep in mind there are a few things that obligations you need to do. You need to coordinate with your broker. You would need to develop your own internal business processes to manage all of the data. They would want you to set up a product registry account on their online portal, and then have either the laboratories or testing facilities input that information. And then, of course, you'd need to provide feedback to CPSC so that they know how things are working. Yeah, so that's about it for the Consumer Product Safety Commission. If you're interested in it or you want to check your products, go to the website and you can look at the tariff numbers, and more information is available on the e-filing website that's linked there. And I think that there's a page of links at the end that'll be available as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Back to me, right? So
Yep.
yeah, very good. Thanks so much for that update on CPSC. So yeah, the first PGA that I'm going to delve into more deeply is the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. That PGA has been participating in ACE the longest, and they really are the most common PGA involved in imports. And so I want to hit on just a few new developments with FDA. First, I want to talk about emergency use authorizations that were utilized during COVID. So when we were in the thick of the COVID crisis, it was recognized that there were several medical devices that were needed, but had not fully made their way through the FDA approval process. So they may have been an unapproved product or an unapproved use of an approved product, or a product manufactured by non-traditional manufacturers. So they were needed to address supply issues. And so they were allowed entry due to these emergency circumstances. And now the FDA recognizes that it may take time for these device manufacturers and distributors to adjust back to normal operations after so long under this EUA process. So they have developed a transition plan to get us back to pre-COVID. It's going to include 3 phases. That final phase begins in November of this year, at which time normal reporting of the intended use codes, the affirmation of compliance codes, device registration numbers, and so on, that all will have to resume. So if you are an importer of medical devices that utilize these EUAs previously, just be prepared for this transition date and make sure you have all of your information together and work with your supply chain and your manufacturers to get the information needed. The next thing on food and drug I want to talk about, a recent update, are the port code changes. So before this new functionality in ACE went into effect, if a shipment arrived at a port other than what we had transmitted to customs and FDA, that entry had to be canceled and replaced entirely with a new entry. It was a very cumbersome, labor-intensive, time-consuming, and expensive process. And I'll be honest, it mostly impacted northern border truck shipments because it's just so convenient and easy for a truck driver to change his plans and show up at a new port. For very legitimate reasons usually, but it mostly impacted the northern border ports. And so now, with good news, the brokers have the ability to correct that port code after the entry's already been transmitted, and both customs and FDA will have visibility to that change. A best practice really does continue to be to ensure your carriers give your broker the correct port of entry. Because although we can now process those port code changes, there are very specific rules and steps that we have to follow in order to make those changes work. So it's an easier process, but it's not completely seamless and easy to do. So try to keep that same best practice in play of staying with the carriers to ensure they get the proper codes transmitted to the brokers. And then finally on FDA, I want to talk about these error reports. So entry filers, so your broker, may opt in to receiving monthly reports from the FDA. UPS has done so since their inception, and that goes back about 10 years for devices, and just this year for the drug report. We have been sharing the results of these reports monthly with our top importers. We have found on the drug report that the number one issue so far has been that the dosage strength is not being reported. Now, dosage strength, it is an optional data element, but FDA has said if you report it and report it correctly, it may speed up the release of the shipment. So it's good to see these error reports to show the historical data that's been perhaps missing or incorrect, so that you can correct it for future transitions. So really important to note, we cannot correct the entries that show up on the reports, but we can only notify the importer of what the findings were and ask them to ensure correct data on future imports is provided. That will help to expedite release by FDA on those future imports. So contact your UPS rep if you want to receive either the medical device report or the drug report, and we can get you set up to receive that on a monthly basis. Okay, let's jump in now to USDA, talking about the National Organics Program. So when you think about organic, what products come to mind, right? For me, it's fresh produce, eggs, and meat. That's what comes up to mind first when I think about I want to buy something that's called organic. But really, the list is quite long for goods that may qualify. like cotton and cotton fabric, wearing apparel, even soaps and cosmetics, some furniture. So there's a lot of products that could be sold or marketed as organic. If you sell or market your goods as organic, you'll need to start making that declaration at time of import once this mandate goes into effect. And we're expecting it about in 1 year, around March of 2024. And it's going to start with just that produce. Although the list is endless of what could be considered organic, they're starting to enforce it first on just the produce. So March 2024, what that means is that your broker will need to include the organic import certificate number in their ACE transmission. So the USDA will confirm that a valid certification number is being reported and that it matches the goods that are being imported. That sounds kind of simple, right? But although reporting is simple and it is a one-step process, there's a lot of effort by the importer and their suppliers that goes into securing the certificate. And that includes, ensuring proper labeling, record keeping, inspection, third-party certification of the facilities, and product traceability, and the list goes on. So yes, certifying organic is a big deal. And it's a very simple deal for your broker once you've got that certificate in hand. And so one more thing to point out, it's the ACE mandate of March 2024 that is dependent on USDA finalizing their organic integrity database and making it available to use. So it's possible the date might get pushed back if they do not get their database up and running on schedule. So we've shown here on the slide, the middle section of the slide talks about HTS updates. And so why is that important? There are some commodities where there's an organic HTS number along with a conventional HTS number. As you know, HTS, Harmonized Tariff System, that is the tariff number. So if the organic number is chosen, the filer will receive a reject message unless they put in that certificate number. If the conventional HTS number is used, there'll be no such message and entry can proceed without any further input. But there will be hundreds of HTS numbers that don't have that organic breakout and we'll get a may be required message. So if it's not organic, we'd have to enter a disclaim message. And if it is organic, of course, we need to follow through with that certificate number. So the USDA has an ongoing efforts with the ITC, International Trade Commission, to break out more and more HTS numbers. So it really is incumbent on the importer to know if their HTS number is changing and to make sure you select the appropriate one, whether it be organic or conventional. And a best practice now is to place a notation on your commercial invoice to enable your broker to select the correct HTS number. And then we would then request certificate numbers when organic, and we could even hard code that disclaim instruction when it is conventional. So if we know that information now, we can be all set up and prepared for when this goes live on ACE. So it will help to expedite the clearance of the goods once this mandate does come rolling around. So a little bit of work you can do up front to be prepared for that. Okay, let's go on to the Lacey Act now. So what is the Lacey Act? Well, it's an act that's under the purview of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So it's another program, and there are some upcoming changes to the Lacey Act. So what the Lacey Act does, or they attempt to ensure that plant products are not illegally harvested. So each imported shipment of covered goods have to be accompanied by a Lacey declaration. That's called a PPQ 505. It's a plant and plant product declaration. It traces the plant material back to its country of harvest. So even if you're importing, for example, a wooden picture frame that was manufactured in China, you would still need to know the genus and species of the wood that was used and where it was harvested, which is very likely different than where the picture frame was actually manufactured. So yeah, it requires the importer to go back a little bit further in their supply chain than they ordinarily would. So we're expecting phase 7 of the Lacey Act to be implemented in 2024. And the USDA has said that it's going to include all remaining non-composite goods, such as furniture, along with pork and essential oils. So we are expecting the list of covered HTS numbers sometime this fall. And then there's going to be a 6-month implementation period before completion of the form and transmission of the data via ACE becomes mandatory. That 6 months is designed to allow importers to be able to research their supply chains and determine where that wood or other plant components of the imported articles were harvested. So it's recommended that once this list of HTS numbers under phase 7 gets published, to take a look at it. If you import any impacted articles, you'll want to immediately get to work because you'll have 6 months to gather your information. And that goes all the way back to where, again, the plant product was harvested. That could very well be a heavy lift for an importer. And if you've never had to complete a Lacey declaration before on other products, get your hands on a form right now and learn what data is needed for completion and just understand how to do that. And finally, the last step is to make sure you keep your eyes and ears open for official communication when that mandate date is announced. So make sure that you are fully compliant on day 1. Okay, I think my final PGA is the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So as I've mentioned at the top of the call, the EPA has several programs that cover a lot of commodities. So I want to call out specifically pesticides and devices because EPA has been stepping up on enforcement of that recently. The specific legislation that regulates pesticides and devices is FERPA, right? The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. So the thing about pesticides and pesticide devices is sometimes you don't even know that your product is regulated. So you have to understand EPA's definition of a pest in order to know if your product is a pesticide or device. So a pest is any living organism, such as a rodent, but also includes mold, virus, and bacteria. So even microorganisms may be considered a pest. And a pesticide or device is intended to destroy, repel, trap, or mitigate those pests. So pesticides may include a Clorox wipe or other cleanser that claims to kill 99% of bacteria that it comes into contact with, right? A device may include water or air filters if it makes the claim that it's going to trap airborne or waterborne virus or bacteria. So think of all the air filters that hit the market hard during the peak of COVID. Those are regulated by EPA, and the EPA has been diligently enforcing their standards and ensuring anything that makes such a claim that it actually can do that. So we have included here a link to a frequently asked questions document that the EPA recently published. They held a webinar a few months ago, and they had over 2,000 participants, and they received hundreds of questions during that live presentation, and they couldn't possibly get to all of them. So they took their time to record and answer every single question and published it in this document. So they're one of the few PGAs that have gone that extra step to help ensure that importers and brokers and other parties of interest are well informed of the requirements because they really do want to ensure compliance. So they want to give as much information as possible. So on that note, I think I've talked long enough and it's time for questions and answers. So I'm going to turn it back over to Anne, who's going to help us to facilitate some of these questions.
Yes, thank you, Kelly, so much. And we did have a few questions come in. I know that Stuart, they've been answering some of those in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead. There was one question about the FDA reports. Can an importer register with FDA to receive the monthly FDA error report directly, or is that only offered through their customs broker?
My understanding is that it's only available to the filer of the entry. So you have to get the report through your broker.
Okay, perfect. And then there was a question and Stu answered it, but I'm gonna go ahead and just run through it real quick for those who maybe didn't see it in the chat. It was, is it common for PGA to refuse a product if it passes through customs? And Stuart's answer is yes. FDA admissibility rules are different than CBP. So each agency reviews their rules only. It relates, Kelly, back to what you said in your slides about overlapping agencies. So yes, FDA can refuse. And then we had a question on the Lacey Declaration. I think Rob answered that. It is in there as well. Let's see if any other questions came up, or if you have any, pop them in the Q&A real quick. We can give a few minutes for some last minute questions. And just as we're waiting to see if any other questions come in, a reminder that there will be a survey that will pop up after the webinar closes. If you have a few minutes to take time to take that, that would be great. Let's see. I see that Anna posted the EPA webinar FAQ in the chat. So if you are interested in that, the link is there. Well, I am not seeing any other questions come in. So I guess I want to go ahead and thank Rob, Kelly, and Stuart for their time today and the great information. And thank you for everyone who joined today. As mentioned at the beginning of the call, this was recorded and it will be available to everyone who registered. If you've come up with questions or we didn't answer them today, we'll be sure to have someone reach out to you after the call. And again, if you could please take the survey once the webinar closes, we'd appreciate it. And thanks to everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.